Tonight on KQED Newsroom, with Tuesday's elections looming, immigration once again takes center stage, while two high-profile state measures on the gas tax and rent control face dim prospects. And #hate. How much responsibility should social media companies bear for the spread of anti-Semitic and racist content? Plus, the most documented, undocumented immigrant, Jose Antonio Vargas, shares his new memoir on lying and hiding. Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. We begin with the high-stakes midterm elections. In the final days before voters head to the polls, President Trump has made a number of immigration pronouncements in an effort to appeal to his base. They include a proposed end to birthright citizenship in this country, and he once again targeted the caravan of Central American migrants, suggesting that federal agents can fire at them if they toss objects. All of this has significant implications for California, home to about 1/4 of the nation's foreign-born population. Meanwhile, new polls show Proposition 6, the repeal of the state gas tax, is trailing among voters. The same is true for Proposition 10, which would give cities the ability to expand rent control. As part of our ongoing election coverage, I'm joined now in studio by our own KQED California Politics and Government team, Senior Editor Scott Shafer, reporter Marisa, and reporter and producer Guy Marzaroti. Always good to see you guys.
Thanks for having us.
Scott, Democrats are hoping, as you know, to flip those 7 GOP seats in California that they've been trying to target in their quest to win 23 seats to retake control of the House. So how is the current messaging from President Trump in the White House on immigration affecting those key races? And does it vary depending on whether it's a Central Valley race or an Orange County race?
You know, there are so many cross currents happening right now. You mentioned the birthright thing with immigrants, the caravan, and just a week ago there was the shooting in Pittsburgh at the synagogue. You add in the pipe bomber, so there's so many different things happening. It's hard, I think, to isolate one thing and say what impact is it having. That said, I mean, we are showing a lot of voter interest. The Secretary of State today came out with final registration numbers for California, and 78% of eligible voters are registered. It hasn't been that high for a non-presidential election since 1950. So there's a lot of interest. How it's playing out, I think Democrats have been very focused on not getting distracted by Trump and trying to stay on their message of health care, the Republican tax bill, jobs, that kind of thing. So I think if Trump succeeds, you know, he will up the turnout among Republicans, but Democrats are already mobilized.
Well, and I think it's telling that as Trump is going around the country to some of these key states, he's not coming to California. And I think that might be partly for his own reasons, but also I don't think in every district it's a good idea to be seen next to the president, right? If you're in even a Central Valley district that is pretty conservative, but with a huge Latino population, those immigration messages are not going to play very well. Orange County is, you know, diversifying. It's a mix of people. And so I think that for Republicans in California, there's been this kind of tightrope to walk this entire campaign where they want to appeal and sort of ally themselves with the president in some ways. But in this harsh immigration rhetoric, it may not play as well in California.
Did you want to say something, Guy?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I think certainly you can see by how the president is moving in these final days of the campaign. He's really focused on Senate races. That's where he's spending his time. As Marisa mentioned, he's not coming to California. He's really not spending time in those suburban districts that I think will decide the balance of power in the House. And I would say for Democrats, they're singularly focused on health care. But I think there is a big difference when you go to a place like in Orange County where they're behind in registration and really need to sell a centrist message to somewhere like the Central Valley where they have a registration advantage. And at this point, it's really about turnout.
And speaking of the Central Valley, that is a particularly interesting race there. And this may come as a surprise to some people, but the nation's most expensive congressional race so far this year, because the election day is just on Tuesday, is here in a solidly blue state in the Central Valley. That's where the incumbent Devin Nunes, he's the Republican chair of the House Intelligence Committee. He's also emerged as the chief defender of President Trump. He's the incumbent. His Democratic challenger is Fresno prosecutor Andrew Jantz. So how much money is being spent on this one race, and why is it so expensive?
Well, it's sort of ironic because this is actually the least likely to flip of a lot of these districts, right? It's not actually one that I think Democrats saw saw long ago as an opportunity. But what's happened is that Nunes has really upped his fundraising game. I mean, a couple of years ago, he raised maybe $1 million, didn't really have an opponent. He's raised more than $11 million. And most of that is not from his district. It's not in California. It's on the D.C. circuit. We're talking lobbyists. We're talking, sort of big conservative donors. On the other side, Andrew Jan's a prosecutor, I think has excited Democrats. I think it's an uphill battle, but he's raised $8 million himself. And so what's happened is we've seen, I think, a conversation happening in the Central Valley, even with the sort of registration favorability to Nunes, that we haven't seen. In the Fresno Bee, for example, has been in this war with him. They, for the first time in years, did not endorse Nunes.
And I think it's one of those seats Democrats would love to flip, even though they probably know it's kind of a reach, to say the least.
Yeah.
Personal.
It's personal. I was up in Sonoma and I saw Andrew Jan signs, on somebody's house. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think a lot of the money that Marisa alluded to is coming from the Bay Area, because the Central Valley is not a wealthy area. There's not a big bunch of big donors or wealthy people. It's a very poor area. So yeah, I think there's just a lot of excitement. It's one of those seats that they'd like to flip if they could, Democrats, but they know it's a reach.
And Nunes has been reelected 7 times.
Yeah, and he has, and he's actually been endorsed by the Fresno Bee every time until now. And as Marisa said, there's a war going on, sort of like an echo of what Trump says about the media, and he's focused it all. Had a 40-page mailer he put together, all focused on the Fresno Bee.
And Guy, in these congressional races, like in places like Central Valley, are voters more focused on local issues, or are they more concerned about what's coming out of the White House?
It's always the national issues. I think you see this every midterm election. It ultimately is a reflection and a referendum on the president and what's happening in Washington. As much as Republicans have tried to make this about local issues, I mean, they know how unpopular Donald Trump is in many swing districts in California. They want to talk about the gas tax. They want to talk about things happening, at the DMV and more local issues. It really isn't. I mean, I think Trump is on everyone's mind, on the mind of voters. And so I think for Democrats, they succeed when they turn the conversation back to the president and back to issues like health care, where I think Democrats have much more of an advantage.
All right, let's talk about some of the propositions as well, because we have 2 very high-profile ballot propositions. And one of them is Proposition 6, the gas tax repeal. And a new poll out this week from UC Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies shows that it's trailing. It's 56% of likely voters are opposed. So, Scott, getting rid of this gas tax was supposed to be a rallying cry for the GOP. What happened?
Yeah, well, in some ways, the biggest impact of this happened a while ago in June, when Josh Newman, the freshman senator from Fullerton, Orange County, who had voted for the gas tax, was the target of a repeal, of a recall, and he was recalled. And that took away the 2/3 majority that the Republicans had in the Senate. But since then, it's really petered out. John Cox has put in a bunch of money to get it on the ballot, but really the money's dried up. And there's a huge amount of money on the other side, because you've got labor, you got the Chamber of Commerce, you got contractors, local officials have all really teamed up to say, we don't want to have this transportation money taken away.
I mean, that's what made this campaign so interesting to me. Before this measure qualified for the ballot, $3.8 million spent by supporters. After that, $1.5 million. So it's almost as if the campaign has just petered off. They wanted to get it on the ballot, not only for turnout, but to give Republican candidates something else to talk about other than Donald Trump.
And I think, just quickly, I think they were worried that a Republican wouldn't be in the top 2 of the governor's race. Now there is one.
But who raised a lot of that money was Mimi Walters, who's now a congresswoman who's in a very tight race with her Democratic challenger. She's not going to be putting the money behind a gas tax repeal that she was 6 or 10 months ago.
Okay, let's talk about Prop 10 as well. That's the measure that would allow cities to expand rent control. And a whopping 60% of the voter survey said no. I mean, and then a different poll by the Public Policy Institute of California said even renters are rejecting this measure. Why is that?
I mean, it's even more fascinating when recent polling has showed that people support the idea of rent control, but do not support Proposition 10. I think that you get to the spending and the messaging in this campaign. Number one, the no side has spent 3 times more than the yes side. I think that plays a huge role when you talk about advertisements, getting the message out there. And the actual ballot language itself is kind of confusing. It's talking about repeal and not, expansion of rent control. I think some people might read that and say, wait, am I voting to repeal rent control? All of those things, all those factors have added into the fact that, it's every poll we're seeing, it's not doing well.
Okay, and real quickly, I want to touch on Prop C. It's a local measure here in San Francisco, but lots of national attention because Salesforce CEO Mark Benioff supports it. Twitter's CEO Jack Dorsey opposes it. You've got this battle of the tech titans going on. Where will all of this end up, Marisa? This is the homeless measure.
Yeah, this is a measure to tax these very big companies to pay for homeless services. It looks like it will probably get more than 50% and win. The question is, will it be challenged in court? And I think the fault lines it's opened up among the tech community, but also among Democrats. You know, Nancy Pelosi, Dianne Feinstein are for it. Mayor London Breed is against it. It's an interesting battle and one that will not end next Tuesday.
All right, you guys have been busy and you're going to continue to be busy. Marisa Lagos, Scott Shafer, and Guy Marzaroti, you will all be covering it, I know, and we will see all of you back here next week for a full roundup of the election outcomes and their impacts in California. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And just a reminder, this coming Tuesday, join us on KQED Radio and online for full Election Day coverage. Now to hate speech on social media. A deadly synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh last weekend and a series of pipe bombs mailed to prominent Democrats. These incidents are intensifying scrutiny of the role that social media plays in inciting violence. The Pittsburgh shooter posted anti-Semitic comments on Gab.com, a site that's popular with right-wing extremists. That site is offline for now. Despite efforts to police and remove hate speech, many other sites like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and WhatsApp remain fertile ground for hateful speech. Here now to talk more about these issues are New York Times technology reporter Mike Isaac and The Verge's Silicon Valley editor Casey Newton. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having me.
Mike, I know that you have been reporting on how hate proliferates online, using Instagram as an example. So when you searched for anti-Semitic content on Instagram right after the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, what did you find?
So the surprising thing, I guess, about the moments just directly after the shooting is that we didn't even have to really look that hard to find anti-Semitic content on Instagram. All we did, my colleagues and I just started typing in, you know, fairly non-offensive words, like, you know, we wrote Jews or Judaism or just sort of anything related to the events of over the last weekend. And one of the first hashtags that came up was hashtag Jews did 9/11, which is, you know, insane and completely not related to the events that went on.
Basically claiming that Jews were behind somehow the September 11th attacks.
Yeah, exactly. And the problem for Instagram is that this stuff, every time a major news event happens, or in this case a tragedy, people who are trying to troll these platforms can just start flooding the zone with a bunch of just super messed up content, basically, and it's hard for them to even figure out how to catch it immediately.
And it was pretty intense because you found nearly 12,000 posts with that hashtag, Jews did 9/11. And I know, Casey, that the impact of hate and misinformation online is happening globally as well. Tell us how social media affected the recent presidential elections in Brazil.
Sure. So in Brazil, we saw a situation that many have compared to one that we saw in America not that long ago, where social media sort of conveyed this sense of perpetual outrage and panic, and it made the country really vulnerable to a more far-right authoritarian type who comes along and says, don't worry, I'm going to make it all better. And what happened in Brazil in particular was that on WhatsApp, people were able to use part of the app which lets people forward sort of memes, texts. They can go a really long way, and they can be used to promote misinformation. And because the app is encrypted, we have a hard time seeing inside to see what people are saying.
And we've seen instances in Myanmar, for example, where Facebook was used to whip up anxiety about the Muslim Rohingya minority. We've seen fake stories on WhatsApp in India about child kidnappings that led mobs to murder people. So there are several instances out there, very glaring instances. So in these cases, whose job should it be to rein in these lies and conspiracy theories? Should the media be responsible? Should the government? Should social media companies themselves?
It's a real, you know, I mean, I'm sure you hear this all the time. It's a real hard tension between the idea that we should be able to communicate privately with one another, or we, you know, worry about free speech being regulated or sort of tamped down on by governments or companies or the press or whatever, right? Like part of at least an American democracy is to be able to say what you want. But the idea that this free speech can still have real world consequences, and in some cases, like actually deadly consequences. And I think right now we're grappling with how to construct these services in a way that doesn't amplify things in a like an oversized manner and really sort of show that influence in a different way?
You know, I think everyone probably has a role to play here. There is a role for the government in doing some kind of regulation. There's a role for the press to try to identify some of these phenomena as they're bubbling up. But I do think that the social media companies themselves have a special responsibility to do something. They are the ones who decided to grow into these places. They are the ones who decided to open up shop in Myanmar and start selling ads there and start generating revenue there. And the fact is they just didn't have a plan for how they were going to moderate the content that was on the platform. So what they're essentially doing now is sending out a bunch of janitors hoping to clean it up. And so far, those results have been pretty mixed.
What are they doing? You know, you refer to them as janitors, but you know, Facebook has, for example, touted this hiring 10,000 people to actively look for all this stuff. How is that working?
I see it. I mean, I don't know what you think. I see it as like a kind of a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. Honestly, like you can hire thousands of people to try and clean up different things that are going around, but you know, Facebook has 2 billion people using it a month, a billion, at least a billion every day, untold billions of pieces of content circulating on there. So there's no way that tens of thousands of people are going to catch this. Their big thing is AI, essentially.
Artificial intelligence.
Yeah, what they say is that they can sort of use these tools that are essentially just scanning for patterns in all of the text and videos that people are uploading and say, oh, that looks a lot like hate speech, that looks a lot like an incitement to violence. And they said that over time, they're going to be able to, you know, dramatically reduce the amount of hate speech they see on the platform. And I believe them, by the way, like that is an effective tool and they're already using it and they're having some success with it. You know, the issue has just tended to be, as Mike just said, that the problem is bigger than their efforts to contain it so far have been.
And there's also the additional problem of bots. I mean, you know, that's something that's kind of taking off on its own. I mean, you know, human users still account for much of the hate speech on, you know, on social media, but there are all these automated bots out there. I mean, when I was reading recently about an Anti-Defamation League study that says anti-Semitism and hate crimes surged in the U.S. over the past 2 years. Almost 30% of the accounts tweeting against Jews on Twitter are from bots.
Yeah, it is a really sad state of affairs, frankly. Twitter has known about this bot issue for a long time. Now, what they would say is that they want to permit people to create these kind of bots because bots can also be used for good. There's a bot that's very popular among political reporters that tells them whenever a member of the Trump family has followed a new Twitter account or who has liked a tweet. That can actually maybe give you some insight into what the Trumps are thinking about, right? That's a bot. I would argue that's a pretty innocuous bot. But when you sort of let everyone have access to those tools, some of them are going to go out and they're going to build really bad ones.
And one person can spend maybe a couple $100s and buy thousands of bots to flood Twitter with, you know, anti-Semitic content or something. So even, you know, even one guy with a little bit of money can have a much bigger influence than they possibly should be on the platform.
In fact, just today as we're recording, bots, I believe, helped contribute to the trend, Kill the Jews trend. It was a top trend on Twitter. And the reason was that there was an anti-Semitic incident in a synagogue in New York, and so there were mainstream media outlets who were reporting about it. But first of all, it turned out that that particular phrase hadn't even been used in the incident. But by that point, it was too late, and many people had already seen this as the top trend.
And Mike, what should the government's role be in this, right? Because there is a federal law under the Communications Decency Act that protects these companies from being held accountable for what people post on their sites and their platforms. That took effect, though, more than 2 decades ago. That was when, you know, Facebook people were just telling people about what happened in their day. You know, YouTube had cute cat videos. We are no longer in that territory. So should those regulations change?
I think we're starting to see the heat intensifying from Congress right now. You know, there's Senator Mark Warner of Virginia has introduced the Honest Ads Act, which sort of provides more transparency into the types of political ads people can buy on Facebook, so you can actually see who's doing the advertising and if it's from someone who's trying to manipulate people in a different country or something like that. So there's more. I think they're reining it in. I think the tech companies are pushing back, saying, you know, we don't want to, again, it's the free speech argument. We don't want to tamp down on speech, and we don't want to be the arbiters of speech. So it's still a push and pull. I'm going to see how it plays out.
It's a complicated debate for sure. Mike Isaac with the New York Times and also Casey Newton with The Verge. Pleasure to have you both here.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Moving now to a personal take on immigration. In 2011, Jose Antonio Vargas, whose journalism career included a stint at the Washington Post, revealed in a New York Times Magazine essay that he was living in the U.S. illegally. Since then, he has become perhaps the nation's most well-known undocumented immigrant. He's done 2 documentaries and appeared in numerous interviews to advocate for immigrants. Now he has a new memoir, Dear America, Notes of an Undocumented Citizen. And Jose Antonio Vargas joins me now to talk about his new book. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's been 7 years since you announced that you were undocumented in a New York Times Magazine essay. And since then, you've produced documentaries, you've appeared in numerous interviews. Why did you decide to write a memoir now?
I actually didn't. Originally, I wanted to write a book about global migration. According to the UN, there's 258 million migrants in the world. And I wanted to understand, what is the human right of people to move? What does that look like? And then the election of Donald Trump happened, and I was living in downtown LA, and the building manager, I was living there for like 2 years at that point, texted me a few days after the election and said, we're not sure we could protect you if ICE showed up in the apartment. You may want to move out. So then that's when I had to kind of face the reality that I've been here 25 years, I can get detained and deported at any point.
That must have been a tough message to absorb.
And then yes, it was, but it kind of forced me to do something that I never want to do, which I think people don't want to do, which is like mental health, right? Like, how do you actually feel what this is? I've been so busy running away from it, I think, and juggling so many things. I don't have to deal with it. So that's, you know, the book, as you know, is structured lying, passing, and hiding, right? And so the book is really about what the psychological toll is of being in this country as a quote-unquote illegal alien, according to President Trump.
And for those who don't know your story, your mom put you on a plane from the Philippines heading to the U.S. to live with your grandparents when you were 12. You didn't know you were undocumented until you were 16 and tried to get a driver's license. In your book, you write just really candidly and sometimes heartbreakingly about your deep alienation from your grandparents. And you write, quote, "The America they dreamed for me was not the America I was creating for myself."
I had to really try to understand why they did what they did. And when I was a kid, when I was 16, I didn't understand any of it. They smuggled me here. They paid somebody $4,500. They had all the fake papers. My grandfather, I grew up in Mountain View, as you know. And so my grandfather thought, I come here, I work at the flea market on Berryessa Road as a janitor, and then I would marry a woman who's a U.S. citizen, and poof, right? But their thinking was, I would work an under-the-table job. I would live kind of this under-the-table life.
And you did not want that life.
I did not want that. I didn't want it because I thought I wanted to exist. I didn't want to just be invisible, right? And I think for me, that was like the #1 thing. The moment I found out I was here illegally, I didn't want to surrender to what that was.
And so you existed for a long time as a journalist. You won awards along the way. But there are some undocumented immigrants who are resentful of the America that you have created for yourself. You write about activists. You write about it in your book, about activists who want to know, where were you, Jose, when we were on the front lines all these years fighting for immigrant rights? Where were you?
I was too busy lying, passing, and hiding. I was too busy trying to create this successful version of what I was supposed to be. Because I think since I found out I was here illegally when I was 16, I had internalized that I was supposed to earn something, right? And I was very honest in the book about that. You know, even when an activist said to me, you know, you can't represent us, you're not even Mexican, right? Because this issue has been so married to Latinos and specifically Mexican. But, you know, look, like this book for me was a way of really exploring what all these issues are and where all the hurt is.
And you're very critical. You blame the media, too, for some of the hurt and some of the misperceptions. You're very critical about how mainstream media has covered immigration. Where do you think the media has failed?
I think, and I think I'm critical of it because journalism is sacred to me, right? Like it was the first thing I ever thought of myself.
You worked for the Washington Post.
I worked at the Chronicle, just a few blocks that way, right? And so journalism is very important to me. What we do is very important to me. And I think the fact that we, in general, there are some exceptions, have failed to really connect the dots between the 11 million undocumented immigrants like me in this country and how that is connected to the 43 million immigrant population in America. So you can't separate the undocumented from the documented. This is actually not about immigration reform, it's about the changing America. Right?
And with President Trump in office,
Yeah.
and with more reporting on issues like the border wall and the family separation issue with Central American refugees, do you see some improvements in the coverage?
Absolutely, and it's kind of embarrassing, frankly, that it took Trump for most of our colleagues in the media to finally wake up that this is a human rights crisis. What Trump has done and is doing is a culmination of all the policies that Democrats and Republicans have been a part of. This has been a bipartisan mess. It's not just Trump.
Do you worry about being deported? You could be any time.
You know, that's the interesting thing. I lived in fear of that for 14 years, from 16 to the age of 30. And the past 7 years, being this public thing that I am, that hasn't really been my worry. I'm ready for it. I've been ready 7 years ago. So that's not the fear. The fear is, am I living my life as fully and as honestly as I can?
Have you thought about what you will do if you are deported?
Yeah, you know, I haven't seen my mom for 25 years, and she's in the Philippines. 2 more years for her to come here legally. She's been waiting in line. So I'd see her. You know, thankfully, I'm a writer and I'm a filmmaker, and I can write and make films anywhere. But look, I think I've decided to stay. And so if the government decides to deport me, it'll be a fight.
Why do you think they haven't deported you?
I have no idea. I actually, you know, when
you're not hard to find.
I'm at Starbucks usually, so they'll find me there. You know, after I came out 7 years ago, a few months later, when I haven't heard anything from the government, I actually called the government myself. I write that in the book. I called ICE myself. I said, hi, I'm Jose Antonio Vargas. I haven't heard from you, right? What do you plan to do with me? And the woman on the line was like, no comment.
Really?
She knew who I was, she said, but she was wondering, why are you calling us? Well, I haven't heard from you. You know, as a journalist, I'm like, we have to follow up the story. And so I come out. Obama at the time was deporting 400,000 immigrants, and why wasn't I one of them?
How has your concept of being a citizen changed since you came out as an undocumented person?
So I am not a citizen because I was not born in this country, the accident of birth. And I'm not a citizen because legally I am not. I would argue that there's a different kind of citizenship that undocumented immigrants subscribe to, and it's citizenship of participation. I actually think it's miraculous that undocumented immigrants get up every day, go to work, send their kids to school, and provide for their families, even under this administration.
Many of them pay taxes.
Pay taxes, parts of their communities. I think that's miraculous, and I think that's a different kind of citizenship, and I would argue a deeper kind of citizenship.
Okay, Jose Antonio Vargas, your new book is Dear America, Notes of an Undocumented Citizen. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And that will do it for us. As always, you can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. Thank you for joining us.